Wait till the camera gets on.
No.
Okay. He was born in Warsaw, January 11th, 1907, and he was a descendant of a long line of outstanding leaders of Hasidism. Among his paternal ancestors, he counted Rabbi Dovber of Mezerich, the great Magi, successor to the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Actor Rebbe, was his great-great-grandfather, and Rabbi Israel of Rizian, and that's the Actor Rebbe's real name, Rabbi Israel of Rizian. On his mother's side, he traced his lineage to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, the famous charismatic Hasidic master, and Rabbi Pinkus of Koretz. So he came from this very steep Hasidic background. It's amazing that he got out of Poland, in other words, with that type of training. He grew up, of course, in this world of Jewish piety. Heschel gained he had great knowledge of the Jewish religious heritage that was acquired through undeviating attention during most of his waking hours to the study of rabbinic literature. At the age of 10, he was at home in the world of the Bible. He had acquired confidence in the subtle dialectic of the Talmud, and he had also been introduced to the world of Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah. At the age of 20, Heschel, after having prepared himself in Poland for the requirements of modern academic life, left the closed world of the traditional life in law and enrolled as a student at the University of Berlin at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaften Judith. Terms. Okay, my German isn't very good. He was there at the same time as Schneerson and Soloveitchik, and they were all in Berlin, the University of Berlin, around the same time. But this is where it differs with Heschel. Although he developed a wide cultural and artistic interest, his studies were concentrated mainly in the fields of Semitics and philosophy. The Hochschule appointed him as student, as an instructor in Talmud, and the publication, published a thing on Maimonides in 1935, a biography and an interpretation of the great medieval philosopher and codifier, and established his reputation as a fine scholar, a gifted and imaginative writer, and a master of German prose. So he was born in Poland. He spoke Yiddish, of course, and now he's in German. He's writing in German. By the way, we'll find out that he writes in English. He wrote in German. He was proficient in many different languages and wrote books in many different languages. Heschel was one of the rare writers who have a distinguished literary style in whatever language they touch. Just when I'm reading what it says, English, German, Hebrew, and Yiddish. His study on Hebrew, prophetic conscience. He earned his PhD at Berlin University, was published by the Polish Academy of Science in 1936. He hailed as an outstanding contribution by leading biblical scholars. This is really interesting. In 1937, Martin Buber chose Heschel to be his successor at the Central Organization for Jewish Adult Education at the Jüdische Lehrhaus. The latter was founded by Franz Rosenzweig in Frankfurt on the Main. There, Heschel taught and directed many of the educational activities connected with the last phase of the memorable German Jewish cultural renaissance that flourished during the Nazi regime, only to come to a sudden end with the pogrom of November 10th, 1938, and the subsequent extermination policy of the war years. He was deported from Germany back to Poland in October of '38, and he taught for 8 months at the Warsaw Institute for Jewish Studies. And this is where luck or whatever really helped him out. The Hebrew Union College, the head of Hebrew Union College, was trying to get Jewish scholars out of Europe, and they got Heschel a visa. He came to the United States in 1939 and went to Cincinnati and was at the Reform Seminary in Cincinnati for 5 years. So he spent the war years in Cincinnati, and the rest of his family perished.
Was he single?
No. Well, no, he was single in those years. He was married here in the United States. After the war, excuse me, in 1945, Heschel joined the faculty of JTS, in the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he held the title of Professor of Jewish Ethics and Mysticism. There he taught until the time of his death, influencing a significant number of rabbis and educators in the conservative movement of American Jewry. He became a sought-after lecturer throughout the United States, and he also held visiting professorship at a number of universities. In 1965, he became the first Jewish theologian to be appointed to as a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He had a huge influence, and Heschel played an important part in the delicate negotiations between Jewish groups and Catholic Church in the negotiations before and during Vatican Council II. He had a cordial relationship with Cardinal Bey, B-E-A, whose office was responsible for drafting the Declaration concerning of Jews. And in September of '64, when they tried to push down a watered-down version of the Declaration, Heschel was received by a special audience by Pope Paul VI and pleaded for a strengthening and more just declaration by the Council. And during the last decade of his life, Heschel became involved in a number of public issues. In 1963, his pleas for action on behalf of Russian Jews led to the formation of the American Jewish Conference and Soviet Jewry. He also took an active part in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and joined the opposition against the war in Vietnam. After the Six-Day War and lack of sympathy and some outright hostility towards the State of Israel, shown by a good number of liberal Christian religious leaders, it led him to write a volume called Israel, an Echo of Eternity, which was widely disseminated amongst Jews and Christians. And he passed away he handed in his final piece, a completed manuscript, in December of '72, and the following Saturday, December 23rd, 1972, he died at his home in New York City. So that's the overview of Heschel. And if I try to show you with the this is okay. We'll have that. Okay. Try to give you an overview of Heschel is that he was involved in major issues of his time. He was involved in the Vatican Council that came out with a decision not to continue to try to convert Jews to Christianity, Catholicism. He was involved in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King and marched in Selma. He stood up against the Vietnam War at a time when that was not very popular, when most people were supporting what was going on in Vietnam. He stood up and protested what was happening in Vietnam. So those major issues of his time, he was an outstanding, an outspoken voice during that period of time. I'm going to try to now give you an idea of his writings. He was a pretty prolific writer. Some of his most famous books, The Sabbath, Man is Not Alone, God in Search of Man, The Prophets, which he actually wrote in German, and Torah Min HaShamayim. He did, I think it was almost his last thing. It was on the Mishnah, Talmud, and Midrash, and so he was published on those and many other books. To go over some of the books that he was, there's a little piece called The Sabbath, and he's famous for some of the quotes that are in this book, and I'll try to give you things that he said. Judaism is a religion of time aimed at the sanctification of time. Unlike the space-minded man to whom time is unvaried, the Bible senses the diversified character of time. There are no 2 hours alike. Every hour is unique, and the only one given at the moment exclusive and endlessly precious. So Judaism teaches us to be attached to the holiness in time to be attached to sacred events, to learn how to consecrate sanctuaries that emerge from the magnificent stream of the year. And the Sabbaths are our great cathedrals, and our Holy of Holies is the shrine that neither the Romans nor the Germans were able to burn, a shrine that even apostasy cannot easily obliterate. According to the ancient rabbis, it is not the observance of the Day of Atonement, but the day itself, the essence of the day, which, with man's repentance, atones for the sins of man. The whole piece on the Sabbath is to explain that we survive because that Judaism is based on time, not on place. That we're able to observe our Judaism no matter where you are just by looking at the calendar. And that the Sabbath was that he called a cathedral in time, is that it's designed by us. It's a time designed by us. And this business with the Day of Atonement being special, it's not a day on the calendar, but the day itself, the time, the 25-hour day. That's what's important, the time that we spend doing that. He wrote a book called God in Search of Man. It's a much harder book to describe because he's very philosophical and not easy to comprehend in some of his pieces. But if I could try to put it in a few sentences, he basically is saying that God created man to be a partner, right? To be a partner with God to heal the world. He was very much into tikkun olam. So we talk about conservative rabbis back in the 1960s and 70s using the term tikkun olam, which I think was a little unusual. It wasn't out there as much in the conservative movement. But he felt that that's what God was looking for in man. God was looking for man to be a partner, right, to help with the world in being a improvement in the world. His other books, the book he wrote on the prophets was his PhD thesis. I have to read a quote. Heschel called himself the most maladjusted person in society because of his refusal to accommodate himself to evil. He stated that the opposite of good was not evil, but rather indifference, and that we combat indifference by learning how to be surprised. He basically said that the prophets were all maladjusted people. And if you think about it, they were all people who came back to the society and said to them, hey people, you're going wrong, you're doing this wrong, and you're doing that wrong, and they're not behaving themselves. They stood out from everybody else, and he called them maladjusted people. And basically he said he was a maladjusted person, and he had a hard time ignoring things. There was a piece in here that I found. We studied about Rabbi from Argentina, Marshall Meyer. And it says Marshall Meyer was a fighter for human rights while a rabbi in Argentina during the years that the country was under military rule. And he told a visiting Rabbi Heschel in that period, in the late 1960s, Rabbi Meyer recalled telling his teacher that there had been threats against the Jews because of Rabbi Meyer's human rights activities. So he asked Rabbi Heschel if I could endanger the lives of the Jews of Argentina by speaking out. Heschel was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke. You endanger their souls more by being silent. He was these type of answers tried to give you an idea of what he was all about. His business with Martin Luther King, and when asked about the march in Selma, and I have the quote that's a little bit longer than I was, marching with my feet. Heschel's passion for taking people of other faiths seriously was not at odds with his profound Jewish identity. It emerged rather from the heart of his religious observance and sensibility, his sense of the ineffable, before which even the most devout was insufficient. His sense of the ineffable, before which even the most devout faith was insufficient. In other words, because Heschel was steeped in and formed by ancient Jewish tradition, he recognized the holiness of the Christians with whom he marched in Selma. In that moment, he wrote famously, I felt my legs were praying. So I'm trying to put that sentence in perspective. He was very much a person of acceptance of people of other faiths, specifically Christians. He viewed them as religious people, and he was trying to get the people of faith to behave well towards each other. And he was very successful in his time because of his because of the time he spent at the Vatican. There was the American Jewish Committee with Mark Tannenbaum led a delegation back in, I think it's 1962, 64, to Rome. And Heschel was one of the rabbis who went with Tannenbaum and worked on the paper that came out from the church for respect of Jews. And some of the things he said, by the way, in our prayer book, we have that prayer in the back of our prayer book that says, no religion is an island. That prayer is from Heschel. Heschel, it's from a speech he gave, and they took it, part of the speech, and they used it in the prayer book. In his remarks, this is at the Vatican, Heschel addressed questions regarding unity and mutual respect. He spoke of Judaism's sacred belief that the righteous of all faiths will share a place in heaven. To strengthen his point, he quoted from the prophet Malachi, quote, from the rising of the sun to the setting, my name is great among the nations. In every place, incense is offered to my name, and the pure offering for my name is great, even among the nations, says the Lord of hosts. What will save us, Heschel asked, and he answered, God and our ability to stand in awe of each other's faith, of each other's commitment. He continued delineating his own vision while laying out clearly the meaning of faith without fundamentalism. Touching upon Cardinal Bay's theme, he was talking about in the Cardinal's paper, man's greatest task is to comprehend God's respect and regard for the freedom of man, freedom the supreme manifestation of God's regard for man. Man's most precious thought is God, but God's most precious thought is man. So I got to say, it's like we studied some of the other rabbis who were very much into their own religious, I want to call it indoctrination, like Chabad and the Yeshiva University, which was, he didn't believe in really in dealing with the people of other faiths or working with other groups. What's his name? Soloveitchik. Matter of fact, I had read a piece that he was sort of against some of these things that were going on. But Heschel really stood out during this period of time in reaching out to people. Again, there's so many different sources when it comes to Heschel, so let me give you some of this. By the way, his daughter is Susanna, teaches at Dartmouth College here in New Hampshire, and I believe has a lot of his papers and works. Let me just see what I wrote down here. Here are some of the quotes, some quotes from Heschel. Heschel placed blame for religion's apparent declining influence in relation to science and secularism in his time on religion itself. religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, insipid, he said, suggesting that religion in its current form is a pale imitation of the real thing. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Right? Arnold Eisen had interviewed Heschel when Eisen was a college newspaper reporter, and he got an interview with him. So there's a lot of quotes here from Eisen speaking to Heschel when he was a student. So Arnold Eisen reports a meeting with Heschel in which the rabbi said, "My tradition not only gives me the right to speak in its name, but the duty. Heschel considered it an obligation to speak out and act, and to act. The message of the prophets is that God needs us in some way. Heschel is just announcing the same message that the biblical prophets did over and over again, that God wants something from us, and God needs us to help God make this world better." Heschel shared a close relationship with Martin Luther King and was an active and vocal participant in the civil rights movement. He was also an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War at a time when many of his contemporaries supported the conflict. He based these actions squarely on his understanding of biblical teaching and narratives such as the Exodus story. Heschel balanced his Jewish identity with an inclusive attitude towards believers of other faiths. He encountered other people of faith and I think was open even enough to see in them depths of religious belonging. That they too live in the presence of God, and therefore they have kinship with him. And these encounters reinforce one another and grow in him this sense of a mystery beyond any tradition's capacity to fully understand it. Eisen adds that Heschel's conviction that we have something important to learn from one another's tradition is one of the most important things that Eisen learned. The interfaith model set out by Heschel skillfully navigates the challenge of maintaining deep roots in specific religious tradition while reaching out to those similarly rooted in different tradition. Eisen described Heschel's approach like this: "With humility, we listen to God as best we can and do God's work in the world as best we can, along with others who likewise feel compelled to do God's work in the world. It summons us to action without giving us the security of the ultimate truth." So basically he's saying none of us have the ultimate truth, but if people are willing to work together for the same goal, he viewed that as positive. "In the face of violence and injustice," Heschel said, some are guilty, but all are responsible." Eisen says that for Heschel, living a life of religious integrity meant being constantly aware of the transactions between the suffering of others and our own freedom and joys. Heschel believed that words were extraordinarily powerful. His daughter Susanna recalls her father saying that the Holocaust started with language and propaganda, not guns and tanks. "Words create worlds," he used to tell me when I was a child. And Eisen points out this idea that words translate into reality is one that comes from a line in the daily Jewish prayer: "Blessed is God who spoke and the world came into being." So this whole point that we've heard many times here in this congregation about words, how important words are, but when you think about it, it's probably very, very much on target. That the Holocaust started with words and propaganda, not with guns and tanks. Because no one else spoke up and complained, he ended up with what we ended up having. There are loads of quotes by Heschel. But there was one thing here that I failed to mention. Someone asked me about his family. His sister Esther was killed in a German bombing. His mother was murdered by the Nazis, and 2 other sisters died in Nazi concentration camps. He never returned to Germany, Austria, or Poland. He said, "If I should go to Poland or Germany, every stone, every tree would remind me of the contempt, the hatred, murder of children killed, of mothers burned alive, of human beings asphyxiated." Some memorable quotes by Heschel. Our goal should be to live life in radical amazement. Get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed. Someone said he used to wake up, he used to go into the park and tell people, see that tree over there? Isn't that tree amazing? You know? He said he was gifted with a sense of wonder about what he saw in life. When I was young, I admired clever people. Now I'm old, I admire kind people. Self-respect is the root of discipline. The sense of dignity grows with the ability to say no to oneself. A religious man is a person who holds God and man in one thought at one time, at all times, who suffers harm done to others, whose greatest passion is compassion, and whose greatest strength is love and defiance of despair. Wonder rather than doubt is the root of all knowledge. Never once in my life did I ask God for success or wisdom or power or fame. I asked for wonder, and he gave it to me. The beginning of our happiness lies in the understanding that life without wonder is not worth living. A test of people is how it behaves towards the old. It is easy to love children. Even tyrants and dictators make it a point of being fond of children. But the affection and care for the old, the incurable and the helpless are the true gold mines of culture. I'm going to hand out some of these at the end. I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the things he had to say. I'm going to break for a moment. We have a short video that shows Heschel speaking. There was a PBS special done on Heschel. And then we can come back and talk about some of the things he said and questions about his life and so on. Crazy.
Maybe the podium back.
Yeah, let's pull the podium further away.
Thank you.
Some of the quotes you'll hear him talk himself. You know, Did we take it off mute also? No.
Coming up, he marched.
Do it full screen if you can. Yeah. Oh, okay. I hired this guy. It was like a
Good choice.
Okay.
You got to pay him.
Okay. Took care of it.
With Martin Luther King Jr. and was a longtime activist for civil rights and against war. Remembering Rabbi, theologian, and mystic Abraham Joshua Heschel. This weekend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, religious services are planned around the country to remember him and his legacy. Some of them will be in synagogues that are honoring both King and the late Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of King's many courageous supporters. Heschel is widely considered to be one of the greatest American religious figures of the last century, a rabbi, theologian, social activist, and mystic, admired by Christians as well as Jews. He would have been 101 years old this month. Our segment was produced by Steve Brand, a New York filmmaker who is completing a documentary on Heschel called Praying with My Legs. Brand gathered powerful recollections from those who had known him and who wish his prophetic voice were still sounding.
Pick 'em up and lay 'em down right.
It was his participation in the civil rights movement that first made Heschel widely known. In a famous photo of the Selma March in 1965, its leaders wearing garlands, Heschel was the white man with the prophet's beard, two to the right of Dr. King. That was the occasion on which Heschel said he felt he was praying with his legs.
God is either the father of all men or of none. And the idea of judging a person in terms of the black or brown or white is an eye disease.
Heschel also
That was an eye
publicly
disease.
and passionately opposed the war in Vietnam.
How can I pray when I have in my conscience the awareness that I am co-responsible for the death of innocent people in Vietnam? In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible.
The war in Vietnam for Heschel was an ultimate act of dehumanization. To no longer even see that there was an enemy on the other side who was a human being. And Heschel was convinced that if I act with a disregard for the humanity of my fellow human being, I am really ultimately attacking God.
Heschel's daughter Susanna teaches Jewish studies at Dartmouth College.
My father was sleepless over Vietnam. He would be up late at night, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, couldn't sleep. He was so upset. It was on his mind all the time.
Heschel's experience of the Holocaust was one reason for his social activism. He had seen close up what racism and apathy can do, and how violence toward human beings often begins with the abuse of language.
Hitler, he said, did not come to power with tanks and machine guns. Hitler came to power with words.
Heschel was raised in Warsaw and did graduate study in Berlin. Just 6 weeks before World War II, he was able to escape from Europe. Heschel's late wife, Sylvia, remembered.
There were sisters of his who were killed. That was a very painful thing for him. His mother died of a heart attack as soon as the Nazi came to the door. She just fell to the ground. That was awful.
But Heschel never blamed God.
He said God didn't do it, man did it.
Heschel's biographer is Edward Kaplan.
There are moments in which he talks about overcoming despair and overcoming gloom. But the response to the catastrophe is not to focus on the catastrophe, but to focus on human possibilities.
When you ask Heschel, where was God during the Holocaust? His answer was always, of course, where was man? But if you read Heschel carefully, I would say God cares. God weeps with man at his sufferings. God participates in human suffering. And therefore God was there in the Holocaust.
Whenever I get a little down or depressed, I go get one of his books and I read the prophet Isaiah and what he has to say about Isaiah. Because Isaiah was written at a time of the desolation of Israel, and yet it's the loftiest vision of dreams for humankind. It's people's ability to have faith in the midst of persecution and destruction.
At the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, Heschel was a professor of social ethics and mysticism, two powerful strands of Jewish thought. From the prophets, he learned to speak out about the world's evils. From his ancestors, who were Hasidic Jews, known for their ecstatic spirituality, he learned to celebrate life.
I say that the world in itself is so fantastically mysterious, so challengingly marvelous, that not to realize that there is more than I see, that there is endlessly more than I can express or even conceive in just being underdeveloped intellectually.
One of Heschel's main attempts in getting to you, in a sense, is his own sense of radical amazement, to be aware of so many different things. Did you notice the trees? Well, Heschel was in love with trees. You're walking at Riverside Park, don't forget the trees, you know. Don't forget the river. You have to react.
Heschel described the spiritual power he felt as the ineffable.
Oh, ineffable. You love that word. That which is inexplainable, but you know is there. It points to something beyond that which we pray to, meeting God.
Heschel's biographer notes his use of dramatic language to try to reach others' hearts, not just their minds. He read a Heschel description of a mystical experience.
A moment comes like a thunderbolt, in which a flash of the undisclosed rends our dark apathy asunder. The ineffable has shuddered itself into the soul. It has entered our consciousness like a ray of light passing into a lake. I can't believe that someone could write a passage like this without having experienced it himself.
Heschel's deep spirituality drew many Christians to him, among them the Catholic priest and anti-Vietnam War activist Daniel Berrigan, who became a friend.
I was seeing someone who was immersed totally in his own religious tradition and was at the same time charmingly ecumenical, and open to others. I began to understand that the two went together, that if you were a person of deep faith, you were open to others. And you didn't draw lines or boundaries or say, we're inside the circle and others are out. He was one of the chosen who believed that everyone was chosen, and that the very fact of existing in the world meant you were chosen.
Heschel fought all anti-Semitism. He campaigned for the rights of Jews in the Soviet Union, and at the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, he lobbied hard against church teachings that demeaned Jews or anticipated their conversion.
I came out with a very strong rebuke. I'd say I'd rather go to Auschwitz and give up my religion. And that my being Jewish is so sacred to me that I'm ready to die for it.
Over his lifetime, Heschel published 18 books and more than 100 essays. He was driven to share the relevance of Jewish scripture to modern life. In the Sabbath, he saw time as something to be made holy. In Man is Not Alone and other volumes, he said God expects and depends on human beings to carry out his will.
So Heschel considered the world, the challenge today is nihilism. He says the enemy we all face is nihilism. The world is going to hell. The sense of meaninglessness is pervasive. And we have to do something about this.
His friends say Heschel did a lot about it by what he taught, and even more by how he lived.
We are called upon to be an image of God. You see, God is absent, invisible, and the task of a human being is to represent the divine, to be a reminder of the presence of God.
1 year after he said that, Heschel died on December 23rd, 1972. He was just 65 years old. There's more on our website, pbs.org, about Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King, and there's also a link to a site about the forthcoming documentary, Praying with My Legs. At the music from the 2005 tribute to Martin Luther King Jr. by Washington's Choral Arts Society.
I'd like to reflect upon the other rabbis that we've learned about and studied prior to this one. I find that this one coming at the end is a little, I don't mean to compare that one isn't as important as the other, but I mean how different he was than these other rabbis. That Schneerson, who of course was so successful with his group and with Chabad and spreading them around the world, but strictly Chabad, right? His effect was on his own institution. The same with Soloveitchik. It was the Yeshiva University and leading the school into modern times and modern culture. But he was the only one that I saw that really participated in the world. When I say participated in the world, in world events. And I find that was really very...
beyond any labels.
Beyond. He was not just beyond labels, but he stood up for what he thought was right in a Jewish way to the world. He didn't just stand up in his group. He didn't just speak to rabbis at JTS. He went to Rome and he argued about what they were doing in Rome. He went to Selma, Alabama to argue about what they were doing in Selma. He demonstrated against Vietnam. In other words, and he was an interesting, I believe, a very interesting person. Yes.
Did he know Rabbi Zalman?
I have found nothing that I never read any connection between those two, right? But of course there are connections between he and Schneerson, even in school. That there was a story, and I didn't put it in here because I thought it was almost Lashon Hara, that there came a point, something that Schneerson did, that he corrected him. And I felt it was a little, I didn't want to put one on top of the other that way.
When did he go away from his Hasidic ways, dress? And
You saw the pictures. As soon as he got to Berlin, I mean, he was with a bow tie, and in school he was a student, but he obviously didn't have a beard even in Berlin, so he wasn't dressing the part. And I think someplace in the writings they asked him about the beard and the way he looked. He says, you gotta look the part. Seriously, he says, I had to look the part, you know.
Dress for success.
So you dress the part, not dress for success, but dress the part.
Some years ago, Susanna Heschel, I don't remember where it was. It was either, I don't know if it was at the 92nd Street, well, I think more likely it was at the seminary, the JTS, spoke about her father, and her mother was there too. And it was a small group. It was really a wonderful thing to see this. She spoke, and then she showed an interview, I think it was with Edward R. Murrow, but you got to get a real sense of the man. He was so charming. I think if there's anybody I can compare it to when I watched maybe the Dalai Lama, he was so soft and so human. And he looked very neat together in this video. His hair was never combed. His beard was all over the place. He wore shabby-looking suits of bright colors. And they asked his wife, they said, if you could change anything about him, what would you do? And she said his appearance. Because he never cared about the way he looked. He also sort of, I think, he ran himself ragged, because she said he would eat. He would forget about eating because he would be so involved in what he was doing. So I think he just...
I pointed out that Rabbi Edelman, who was sitting as a student in school during that Heschel's time. It's hard to find too many rabbis that graduated or were in JCS in the early 70s before Heschel passed away, or in the late 60s. But there are some out there, and they all, like Marshall Meyer, talk about Heschel. Heschel was their teacher. Heschel was their ethicist, meaning he taught Jewish ethics to rabbis. So he was.
It was Peter Geffen was in this little clip too.
Who, by the way, is in charge of the Heschel school. Right.
He walked with King and with he was a kid then, but he walked with Heschel. And the Heschel school very much is involved in humanistic works and
if I can just, Rabbi Edelman, who is pictured there, actually was the lead speaker for the conservative movement at my installation. He was the speaker, and by the way, that was a very big moment, of course, for the United Synagogue to come here and endorse a non-JTS rabbi. So that was Moshe Edelman back there that was here.
I'm going to pass this around while we're talking if anyone wants to see. This is a brochure on his effect in the Vatican Council. This is the little thing on the Sabbath. This is the book God in Search of Man, and if you can understand that in a book reading, you're better than I am. And there's another piece here between God and man, but this is someone else writing about his writings. So, and all of these things are here at the library at the synagogue. Yes.
Bill, do you have, this is off to the side, but do you have any notion of clergy